You know when you do something simple, without imagining that it could change everything? That afternoon started like any other. The house was silent, in that way that isn't quite bothersome, but also not welcoming. It was a neutral, almost cold silence that seemed to have accompanied my days for some time. My husband was working, as always. Overtime, meetings, commitments that never ended. I had already gotten used to it, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I spent the morning organizing small things, folding clothes, cleaning surfaces that weren't even really dirty. It was more about occupying my mind than about necessity. You know when you do tasks just to avoid thinking too much? After lunch, the heat started to intensify. I walked to the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and stood there for a few seconds, looking at my own clothes as if I were searching for something more than just fabric. And then I chose that skirt. Short, light, simple. Nothing exaggerated. But it wasn't something I wore often either. Maybe because there was no reason to. Maybe because nobody was really looking. I slowly put on the skirt, adjusting the fabric to my body, observing my reflection in the mirror. I tilted my head slightly, as if trying to see myself with different eyes. It had been a long time since I'd done that. It had been a long time since I'd truly looked at myself. I let my hair down, letting it fall over my shoulders, and for a brief moment, I felt different. Not exactly more beautiful, but more present. As if a part of me, which had been dormant, had decided to reappear. It's just clothes, I thought. But deep down, it wasn't just that. It was what she awakened. I returned to the living room with calm steps, trying to ignore that strange feeling. A mixture of slight confidence with something I couldn't name. I picked up my phone, sat on the sofa, tried to distract myself. But there was something different in the air. Something subtle. Almost imperceptible. Until it happened. A simple moment. Quick. Silent. But which, for some reason, stayed. I felt it. It wasn't anything direct. Nothing explicit. But it was enough to make me aware of myself in a way I hadn't been in a long time. A look. That's all. A look that lingered a little longer than it should have. And it was in that instant that something inside me changed. Not abruptly. Not obviously. But enough for me to realize that that afternoon maybe wasn't as harmless as it seemed. It wasn't the look itself. It was the time it lingered that made me uneasy. I could have ignored it. I could have pretended not to notice. After all, it was something so quick. So common if you think about it. People look at each other all the time. It didn't mean anything. But it did. I was in the living room, near the window, when I heard a slight noise coming from outside. Nothing unusual. The neighbor's gate, perhaps, or someone walking on the sidewalk. Instinctively, I turned my face in that direction. And that's when our eyes met. He was on the other side of the street. Standing there. As if he had just arrived. Or maybe he had been there for a few seconds. I can't say. All I know is that, the moment I realized it, he was already looking at me. And he didn't look away. At first, it was just surprise. That quick instant when you realize someone saw you off guard. My body reacted before I even thought. I straightened my posture, adjusted my skirt slightly, as if that could protect me somehow. But the gaze remained. Firm. Silent. And, somehow, too intense to be casual. That's when I felt it. That slight tension in my chest. Not exactly fear. But it wasn't comfort either. It was something in between. Something that kept me alert. Aware. Very aware. I could have left. I could have closed the curtain, turned my face away, done anything to end that moment. But I didn't. I stayed. For a few seconds longer than I should have. And, without realizing it, I looked back too. Not with the same intensity. Not in the same way. But enough to create something between us. Something that wasn't said, but that existed. When he finally looked away, it felt like the air around me changed. As if that brief moment had left an invisible trace, difficult to ignore. I moved away from the window, trying to act normally, as if nothing had happened. But my body wouldn't cooperate. My heart was beating a little faster, my mind restless. It was just a look, I told myself. But it wasn't just that. because if it were, I would have forgotten it already. And I didn't forget. On the contrary, it stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. It came back in small flashes in my mind, the way he stood there, the exact moment our eyes met, the strange feeling that arose in my chest. And the most confusing thing of all was realizing that it wasn't just discomfort. There was something more. Something subtle. Almost imperceptible. But enough to make me think, why did that look affect me so much? My marriage didn't have fights, but it also lacked presence. It took me a long time to realize that. Because on the outside everything seemed right. Stable. Secure. We didn't yell at each other, there weren't big arguments, no doors slamming. It's the kind of relationship that, to an outsider, seems almost ideal. But the silence. It says things no one sees. In the beginning, it wasn't like that. I remember when everything was light. The long conversations, the plans, the small gestures, a touch on the arm, a knowing look, laughter for no reason. There was a connection there. Something alive. But, over time, that changed. Without warning. Without an exact moment I could point to and say, it was here. Routine arrived slowly, as if it didn't want anything. First came the busy days, then the tiredness, then the silences between sentences. Until, when I realized it, we were already living more like two people sharing the same space than like a real couple. He was always busy. And when he wasn't, he seemed distant. The conversations became shorter. More practical. Everyday things, lists, appointments. Nothing that really touched us. Nothing that made me feel seen. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is this: it didn't hurt in an obvious way. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was an emptiness. A space that grew inside me without making a sound. I started to adapt, as we always do. I stopped expecting certain things. I stopped talking about what I felt. After all, there wasn't exactly a problem, was there? At least not one that could be easily explained. But there was. It just didn't have a name. Or maybe I didn't want to give it a name. Because giving it a name would make it real. And deep down, I still wanted to believe that everything was all right. That it was just a phase. That every marriage goes through this. But that afternoon, after that look, something became impossible to ignore. Because, for the first time in a long time, I felt noticed. Not as a wife. Not as someone fulfilling a role. But as a woman. And that scared me more than it should have. Because it wasn't just about him looking. It was about the fact that I felt something. A reaction I didn't expect. An awareness of myself that had been dormant for too long. I sat on the sofa, trying to organize my thoughts, but everything seemed confusing. It was as if a part of me was waking up, while another insisted that it meant nothing. It was just a moment, I repeated. But, deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Because moments like that don't appear out of nowhere. They reveal. And what that moment revealed was the silence that I could no longer pretend didn't exist. It was strange. As if the world insisted on crossing our paths. After that first glance, I thought everything would go back to normal. And for a few days, it did. I continued with my routine, as always. The same tasks, the same schedules, the same comfortable silence, or at least familiar. I tried not to think too much about what had happened. After all, it was just a moment. Right? But then it happened again. I was leaving the house, distracted, looking for my keys in my bag, when I almost bumped into him on the sidewalk. It was quick, unexpected. Sorry, I said automatically, looking up. And there he was. For a second, neither of us spoke. That same strange silence from before. But this time closer. More real. It's okay, he replied, with a slight smile. Simple. Polite. Normal. But there was something there. Something that wasn't in the words, but in the way he looked at me. The way he looked at me again. Not invasive, not exaggerated, but attentive. As if, somehow, he also remembered that moment. I smiled back, somewhat without knowing why, and continued on my way. But this time, my heart raced in a different way. And it didn't stop there. In the following days, I started seeing him more often. First on the street, then near the market, then almost by coincidence. Always at the same times in the same places. Too much of a coincidence. Or maybe, destiny? I laughed to myself just thinking about it. It seemed absurd. I've never been the type to believe in those things. But still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was happening. Something small. But constant. The interactions began discreetly. A good morning here, a quick comment there. Simple, superficial things. Nothing that justified the weight it was starting to have inside me. But little by little, it changed. One day, he commented on the heat. The next, he asked if I had lived there for a long time. I answered, keeping everything light, polite. Always with that invisible line very clear in my head. Or at least, I thought it was clear. Because, without realizing it, I started to look forward to those meetings. To notice the times. To pay attention to details that would have gone unnoticed before. And the strangest thing is that I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. I seemed too innocent for that. It was just a conversation. Just a casual encounter. Just another one of those little coincidences in life. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Because every time our paths crossed, something was growing there. Silent, almost invisible, but present. And I couldn't say if it made me more curious or more vulnerable. Without realizing it, I started to talk to him about things I no longer talked to my husband about. At first, they were just light conversations. We talked about the day, the weather, little things that carried no weight. It was easy, natural. It didn't require effort or explanation. And perhaps that's exactly what made me let my guard down. Over time, the encounters ceased to be mere coincidences. They weren't planned, but they weren't entirely by chance either. There was a kind of silent understanding, as if we both knew, without needing to say it, that we would see each other again. And each time, the conversation progressed a little further. One day, he asked if I worked from home. I replied that yes, most of the time. In the other message, he wanted to know if I liked living there. Simple questions. But that somehow opened up space for something deeper. Until, without realizing it, I started answering more than necessary. Not just what he asked, but what I felt. I talked about the routine. About the tiredness. About that constant silence that filled the house. And he listened. Truly. Without interrupting. Without trying to solve anything. Just present. And that affected me more than it should have. Because it had been a long time since anyone had listened to me like that. It had been a long time since I felt comfortable speaking without measuring every word. It must be difficult, he said once, with a calmness that disarmed me. I shrugged, trying to seem indifferent. You get used to it. But, deep down, I knew it wasn't true. No one gets used to absence. You just learn to live with it. And, at that moment, I realized I was saying things I had never said out loud. Much less to someone from the outside. Much less to him. That should have been a warning. A clear sign that I was approaching a dangerous line. But I didn't. Because, at the same time as there was a slight discomfort, there was also comfort. A silent, almost addictive comfort. I started to look forward not only to the dates, but to the conversations. To the way he paid attention. To the way he made me feel relevant. Seen. And, little by little, that occupied a space inside me. A space that was previously empty. Or perhaps, neglected. I kept repeating to myself that there was nothing wrong. There was no touching. There were no promises. There was nothing that, technically, could be called betrayal. But there was something. Something more subtle. Harder to explain. And perhaps, more dangerous. Because the line that separates the innocent from the intimate is not visible. It doesn't appear suddenly. It moves. And when you realize it, you've already crossed it. Without making a sound. Without intention. But you crossed it. At that moment, I knew I was going too far. And yet I didn't stop. It wasn't planned. There wasn't a clear decision, and now it's going to happen. It was more subtle than that. More silent. Like everything that had been happening between us. It happened at the end of an afternoon. The sky was beginning to change color, that orange hue that makes everything slower, more intimate. I had gone for a walk without thinking too much, just to breathe a little, to escape the walls that already knew all my thoughts. And, as had become common, I found him. He was leaning against the wall near the square, watching the movement, as if he too were trying to escape something. When he saw me, that same slight smile appeared, too familiar for someone who, until recently, was a complete stranger. "A coincidence again," he said, almost jokingly. I let out a small laugh. "I think so." But deep down, neither of us believed it anymore. This time, we didn't go our separate ways. We stayed. We started talking right there, without haste, as if time had slowed down just for the two of us. We talked about simple things at first, but it didn't take long for the tone to change. It always changed. At some point, silence crept into the conversation. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. I could feel it. Something in the air, in the way we were close, in the way our eyes met and lingered a little longer than they should have. My heart started racing. And I knew exactly why. It was there. The line. That invisible line I'd been ignoring for days. Now it was right in front of me. And, for the first time, I couldn't pretend I didn't see it anymore. "You seem different today," he said suddenly. The sentence caught me off guard. Different how? He hesitated for a second, as if choosing his words. More distant. Or maybe more sincere. That hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Because he was right. I was different. Tired of pretending everything was okay. Tired of feeling nothing. "Maybe I'm just tired," I replied, almost in a whisper. He nodded, without taking his eyes off me. And it was at that moment that it happened. Nothing physical. Nothing obvious. But profound enough to change everything. Because, for the first time, I didn't look away. I didn't back down. I stayed there. Present. Open. And in that meaningful silence, something was said, without words. Something that transcended the limits of innocent. Something that could no longer be called chance. I felt it. He did too. And we both knew. I should have left. I should have created distance, remembered everything that was at stake, everything that could be lost. But I didn't. Because, at that moment, it didn't seem wrong. It seemed necessary. As if, for the first time in a long time, I was being true to myself. And perhaps that was the greatest danger of all. Because it wasn't impulse. It wasn't desire. It was the feeling of finally feeling something. And when you spend too much time in the void, even mistakes seem like a kind of salvation. The silence afterward said more than any words. When it was all over, there was no drama. There were no scenes, no grand gestures. It was just silence. But a different kind of silence. Heavier. More conscious. I walked home slowly, as if each step required more effort than usual. The world around me remained the same. People passing by, cars, lights, but inside, something felt out of place. As if I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I sat on the sofa as soon as I entered, without taking off my shoes. I stood there, staring into nothingness, trying to understand exactly what had happened, and why it was still so vivid within me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pure regret. It was confusion. An uncomfortable mix of sensations that didn't fit together. I tried to rationalize. It was just a moment. You didn't plan anything. It doesn't mean anything serious. But none of those phrases sounded true inside me. Because something had changed. And I knew it. The house was the same. The same silence as always. But now it seemed different. Thicker. Harder to ignore. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and didn't drink. I just held it, watching the liquid tremble slightly with the movement of my hands. I felt strange in my own body. As if I had left myself for a few minutes, and returned different. And the worst part wasn't what had happened. It was what I was feeling afterward. Because, along with the weight of the mistake, came a memory I couldn't erase. The way he looked at me. The silence between us. That feeling of existing, even if only for a moment, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And that scared me more than anything else. I should have been clearly repentant. Definitively. But I wasn't just that. And that was the part one didn't want to admit. I sat down again, now with the glass still in my hand, and stared at the wall as if it could give me an answer. What am I doing? I whispered to myself. But there was no answer. Only silence. That same silence that now seemed to carry everything I couldn't say aloud. Because, after that moment, nothing inside me could go back to being exactly as it was before. Tell me, was it betrayal? Or just a heart tired of not being seen? I kept asking myself this question for a long time. Not on the same day. Not the next day either. But little by little, it started appearing in my thoughts when the silence became too heavy. Because after everything, life went on. Things didn't stop. The world didn't change. But I changed. And that was the hardest thing to accept. I started looking at my own routine with different eyes. The same walls, the same schedules, the same short conversations. Everything seemed the same on the outside, but inside I was no longer the same. And that made me restless. Because a part of me simply wanted to erase everything. To pretend it was just a momentary mistake, an unimportant weakness, something that didn't need to be analyzed. But another part wouldn't let me. Because it wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about that moment. It was about what it awakened in me. The lack I didn't want to see. The emptiness I had learned to call normal. And the question began to become clearer and clearer within me. What was I really looking for? Was it love? Was it attention? Was it escape? Or was it simply being seen? I found myself remembering small things. Things I used to ignore. The way I waited for answers that never came. The silence that no longer bothered anyone. Only me. The habit of swallowing feelings to keep everything in balance. And suddenly, all of that started to feel heavier than before. Because when you understand what you were missing, you also start to question everything you accepted up to that point. And that hurts. Not explosively, but constantly. Like a truth that can no longer be unseen. I didn't have easy answers. And maybe nobody does. Because feelings don't follow logic. They just exist. And they persist. Today, when I think about that period, I don't just see a mistake. I see a mirror. A reflection of everything I wasn't saying out loud. And that scares me. A little. But it also teaches me. Because maybe the hardest thing isn't admitting what happened. But understanding why it happened. And I'm still trying to understand that. Maybe you felt that way at some point too. Perhaps not exactly the same way, but somehow similar. So tell me, when the heart starts speaking louder than reason, do we still know where right ends and wrong begins?